Welcome back to my historical look at the Xbox 360, game by game. Today's game is Project Gotham Racing 3, another release title, and a series and game type I've not played too much in the past. But first let's talk about the history of this game a bit. Let's start off with the actual history, or a very short history, of racing games, and racing games in a launch capacity. These sorts of games have always taken the central stage when looking at the release of new consoles. There is something in them, something that they do that makes them the perfect candidates. Cars, although having some challenges such as wheels, are relatively easy to make look good. Not to say any component that goes into Gamecraft is particularly easy, but there is a reason for them to be put on centre stage. Racing games very explicitly are designed to have high fidelity in very specific areas. The cars are gorgeous, but go slow and have a look around at the tracks or crowds, and you may see that there are areas with less effort. This is not to say that people are lazy, just smart. They know what parts of the game your focus is going to be on, the car, the track itself, so let's make these the prettiest elements. And the attention to detail on the cars themselves can be to much a higher standard because of this focus. These are the central concerns of the player. They look good, to a much higher degree than when you are focused on the fidelity of fruit being shot or whatever people purportedly care about in shooters these days. Also, the amount of animation to make a car go is much less than our weird gangly human bodies, and the creators of consoles want to show off these machines in the best possible light. So being able to point specifically towards a section of a game that has been made to such a high standard allows them to beat the drum for their new machine. Lineups usually have a racing game. A quick Google confirms this. Racing games at this stage were fairly well developed, but as often is the case with games, they started in the arcade. For those who do not know, the early era of games were split between arcade and home titles, with large cabinets being able to have more expensive, expansive hardware within them, due to size and also the potential profit that they could make. The cutting edge of games could be found here. There is a bit of regionality to this. The arcade is a lot less prevalent in the UK for instance, but it did exist, whereas in America this is a well-known dichotomy. You get a quick move forward from their initial top-down style, slowly moving into the games that we know today. That is the camera behind the car. This was first developed and achieved in 1976 with Knight Driver, a name I obviously had to double check because I thought it might be Knight Rider and typed that once or twice, and it must be based on it. This is also 1 year after the invention of a sit-down arcade cabinet, an arcade cabinet with a seat, and was available in this style. There is something interesting in having these analog components to the arcade. There's so many options for peripheries for developers in this era that even reading back about it, it gives such a sense of possibility of what could be done. As time goes on, these games came into the home space. Along with an increasing in graphical capability, inventions such as 3D were important, as they were to every game, along with new gameplay elements. Basically they followed the development of the history of games. But if I do any more research on this particular topic, it's going to become a history of racing games, and we're not here to talk about that. So let's get to it. Project Gotham Racing 3. Project Gotham's history comes from the Dreamcast, with the studio's first game Metropolis Street Racer, in 2000 to 2001 depending on the country, by the studio Bizarre Creations. This game did fairly well with the general crowd, with enough big supporters behind it. Interestingly, one of the reviews I read regarding this game mentioned that it recommends renting the game first, an archaic process that seems increasingly odder as days go on. Going to a store, picking out your game and borrowing it for a weekend for cash. And I have to say, thinking back, I do have fond memories of Saturdays going to pick up and choose a game. Metropolis Street Racer brought in different audio tracks for different cities, as well as a day-night cycle linked to the Dreamcast clock. An addition that strikes me as being here to play with the internal clock as an asset of the Dreamcast more than any actual added benefit to the game. For instance, at the time of writing this, winter is drawing in, and every single one of my races would be dark, unless I manipulated that clock. Lastly, Metropolis Street Racer brought in the Kudos system. From what I can tell, it's a very similar system to what we will be dealing with in Project Gotham 3, and I will go into more depth about the mechanic later, but it serves to give you points for different sorts of driving. At this stage it's more important to note that these points go to a different place or for a different reason. You need to accrue them to unlock races. Some of the reviews point out that this is a bit of an error because it means that you have to grind out Kudos to progress. I have to say the need to both drive well and win races is something that is continued into Project Gotham, with its first 2 games being developed for the original Xbox. Having a requirement to drive well is a dynamic that creates a higher level of play to some degree, and it is an interesting change in the 3rd iteration. Both of these games were well received at the time, hence getting a 3rd one. In terms of actual development of PGR3, I haven't got a huge amount to say, there's not loads of stories online to read about it. There is one really interesting GDC talk, a post-mortem that was conducted during active development. For those who don't know, the GDC is an annual conference, the Game Developer Conference, which a whole bunch of nerds get together to talk about production. I've dipped in and out a couple of videos, they are available on YouTube, and some are behind a paywall, or at least used to be behind a paywall, but they are definitely catered more towards the developer audience. The GDC talk itself goes into some tips and tricks that the team learned through development, but mostly it tells a dual story. Firstly, working with new hardware is difficult, and mistakes were made in production order, or how they prioritise things. These seem like they'd be hard questions to answer until you are actually in active development, especially when you're working on a new console. One anecdote talks about breaking the version they were making, meaning the art people couldn't see their assets in the game for 2 weeks. Secondly, it points out how much more expensive games were becoming to make. Bizarre Creations spent £80,000 just on new servers to hold assets and reference photos. It paints an interesting picture of actively trying to figure out how to make these games, all the while accruing increasing costs. Again, just to say it out loud, I'm not a developer and I'm only interpreting various articles, but this was the sense I got from it. It plays in this interesting space that was new consoles, the hardware and the infrastructure available changed so wildly between the consoles at the time that it really creates new difficulties, as well as this increase in fidelity means that assets cost more. So how does it play? Playing PGR3 is immense, even in 2021. It's quick, slick and just a joy. Even to this day. There is something about the speed, the repeating tracks to just getting them perfect, internalising as you go, learning your car and the route. There's 3 sharp corners followed by a straight that I can just nail. I'm not usually a racing game type of person, it's broadly something that I've mostly avoided dipping in here and there, but this game really managed to take me in, even with how old it was. What makes it unique, or at least unique to me? I think the actual form of the racing really helped pull me in. You have to take part in these cups, and each cup is broken down into several races, in which you can earn a medal. The medal you earn is basically the difficulty you attempt the race on, bronze, silver, etc. With each difficulty making the individual race harder. This pairs with each race being one of a set of different types. It can be a standard finish in a certain place, or finish a lap in a certain amount of time. But also there's some more unique, interesting challenges in there. There is time versus Kudos. We have a limited amount of time, but you can delay the stop clock by earning Kudos. The Kudos system itself is this rating system about how you're driving, and it's almost one of the smartest aspects of the game. Doing a drift around a corner, drafting in other cars' aerodynamic wind tunnels, or completing certain objectives earns you Kudos. These go towards your rank, a way of periodically unlocking more cars for you to buy with your earnings from completing races. This means each race you're taking part in has 2 objectives. You want to win, but you want to do it in style for the secondary objective that is Kudos. The reason it's almost one of the best systems in the game is it actually becomes obsolete by the end. I was unlocking cars so quickly that I didn't need that. I would have enjoyed it being constantly a real aspect to care about, but there's just less to be gained from the system later on. And this is the real difference between this game and its predecessors. Buying new cars with each rank is maybe one of the places that the game never fully worked for me also. A component of owning different cars, but also having these different types of races, at best feels like you're completing this toolkit for any situation. If this is a drift heavy race, then I'll take out my TVR and smoothly slide to victory. But I saved too much money right away. I ended up buying this McLaren. And of course it's a good feeling to try out a new car. But at the level I got, these 2 cars basically meant that I had something for all racing types. Although not going to the highest difficulty all the way through might have demanded more cars, I could take on any challenge that was thrown at me with this pair. Each of the races themselves takes place in one of 5 locations throughout the world. They do the thing of having a couple of known monuments from each location, just so you recognise it, but always constructed with racing in mind first. I lived in London for a while, and I broadly recognise some of the locations and how they're fitted together. Most of the parts are roughly actually in the right place, or in the right direction. One trick the game does is having multiple different tracks in each location also. Probably the best way to think about it is if you think about each location as a set of parts of racing tracks, and then the actual races themselves take these parts and form different tracks altogether. This means you can internalise a certain competency by the end of the game, and when you're actually driving around, even if you've never raced on that particular track, you'll start recognising sections, and you'll know as you're going into it, oh, there's a straight here, I can speed up, or actually there's a corner here, I need to slow down. So whilst the tracks are individually different, they're made up of component parts that are recognisable. And it's a really fun way of doing this, I really like this. It brings familiarity to the new. So I mainly played on the normal difficulty. I did at some point decide to notch it up to one of the harder ones, and I absolutely loved it. It changed the game again into this mode of needing to be perfect in each race, really pushing myself to complete the challenge, trying it again and again to get to that stage. I look towards high-end platformers for a similar experience. Your Super Meat Boys or Celeste provoke the same emotions. Testing the water to see what must be done, trying to internalise this, slow progression, inching forward, and then completion of the challenge. Not to be that person, but Dark Souls is also this. And this is what the game gains from its arcadey format. The ability to put you into this zone. You go from race to race to race, always in the action. Unfortunately, I didn't have time to go through all the higher difficulties, but I did complete it all on normal. Just because it's interesting to compare and contrast new games against old games, I've also played a small amount of Forza Horizon 5. A game that by most estimations is great, but comparing it to PGR really actually killed it off for me. The driving model may be better, but there's such a huge amount of ballooning features around it that I really didn't find additive. Instead, the tight pattern memorization of tracks combined with competent driving features created small sections of game that immediately served you. That's in PGR obviously. So even if I was not enjoying a particular racing type in PGR, it would soon be over and I'd be getting to the good bits I did enjoy. And Forza's just not this. It's such a big open world with all these different tracks in it that take ages to get to, and none of them are that memorable. Other people of course want Forza and I don't blame them. You have that, that's great. But there's just too much finding the meat, hunting what's good in it. Whereas in PGR you just got there straight away. It's a game that served me much more readily. I think another interesting note regarding this as a simulation game is the accoutrement that go towards this sense. The menus are self-serious, the attract screen that focuses on cars is not over the top, just showing off what the game is. You get rewards for certain types of driving, and these are all sensible types of driving. And the driving itself could be not that well modelled, I just don't know, I'm not a car person. But it all goes towards this sense of seriousness and prestige. It really feels fascinating that the thing that I got out of it was essentially the same enjoyment as a platformer, even if both of these styles of games are so different and come from such different histories. So that all being said, PGR 3 is great. I don't really want to make this series a buyer's guide, but I keep talking about it, so into some sort of retro games, go try this one out, seriously. Especially if you're interested in racing as well. So let's talk very briefly about the legacy of the game, and I say briefly because there isn't a huge amount of it. It was well reviewed at its time, but it doesn't have this same imprint that other popular titles do to this day. When you research a game like GTA or even Cameo, there's a much greater echo created. Think pieces are still being written about these ones now. I think it being a racing game might have a bit to do with this. Each iteration of the good ones gets rid of its need of its predecessors, and it tends to be much more incremental in design, unless it's something just wildly different out of this style of game. That being said, there is something to this game that is still well remembered. It goes into a collection of a genre that has much greater heights for those who cared, but you still get whisperings of Project Gotham Racing whenever Forza is mentioned. Thank you for watching. My name has been Billy. Goodbye.